Welcome to this webinar, Writing the Dissertation, the Results and Discussion. This is part of a series I do called Writing the Dissertation, where I try and break down the sort of standard dissertation structure into different parts and chapters. For example, I do a webinar on introduction and conclusion. I do one on the literature review. I do one on writing the method or methodology. And obviously this one is about the results and discussion. So that's what we're going to cover today. I'm very mindful that everybody is coming to this session with different expectations within different disciplines, within, of course, with very different dissertation topics. So I'll try to make this as relevant for you as possible, whilst also making it as sort of general as it needs to be, so that it's not going to isolate anybody. It's going to be relevant enough for everybody to watch this. So this is what we're going to do. We're obviously going to be looking at the results and the discussion in the context of a standard dissertation. We're going to look at the difference between the two, because there is a significant difference between the two, even though there's a lot of overlap. And I'm very mindful that you might be watching this, particularly if you're in a humanities disciplinary background or perhaps in law, and you might not follow the standard, somewhat standard structure of a dissertation, which has an introduction, it has a literature review, methodology, results discussion structure. You might not follow that, and I'm very mindful of that in all the other sessions I do, that you might not follow that structure. This is probably the one session more than any of the others where some of what I'm going to say won't be as relevant to you if you don't follow this standard structure. I do hope that you still find plenty to take from it, particularly when we go into the sort of the structure stuff, which I've mentioned down here. Some of this stuff is definitely going to be relevant for you, regardless of how you structure your dissertation. So certainly if you do the standard dissertation structure, whether it's undergraduate, postgraduate, doesn't really matter. This is definitely for you, but I'm also mindful if you're not going to do that structure, then there'll still be stuff here that you can take from this session. So we're going to break it into two. We're going to look at the results and discussion separately, but we will cover the difference between the two first, which we'll do in a minute. Then we'll look at the main conventions of the results chapter, the main conventions of the discussion chapter, and we're going to look at examples to do this. I'm very, very keen that you have examples to look at, and you really can apply some of the principles that I'm talking through. And then we're going to think carefully about structure as well. What are the sort of structural principles that help to govern a clear results and discussion chapter or set of chapters, and think about a structural template in particular for the discussion chapter as well. The other point I'd make just before we go any further is I'm mindful that normally the results and discussion sections are separate chapters. They can be one chapter, and I'm predominantly going to talk about them as separate chapters, but to be honest, it doesn't really matter whether they're together or separate. Everything I say really is still applicable, and actually at the end I've got a very brief example of the discussion and results together, just to cover that basis as well. The examples we're going to look at as well will be from various different disciplines, so you should get a wide spread of examples. So let's crack on. Any questions as we go through, please stop me. I'm keeping an eye on the chat, so do drop anything in there. Let's briefly cover the difference between the two first, because there is a difference between the results and discussion, even though there's a lot of overlap. And I suppose the best way to define both of them, the results and discussion, unlike, for example, the literature review, is this is very much where you report on what you've found and really report on what's significant about the information, the findings that you've discovered. Obviously, you talk a lot about what you've done in your method or your methodology chapter, but you don't report on the results. So the results is the first time that you do that, and then the discussion considers the results, but in a slightly different way. So this is the sort of I guess the fundamental differences between the two, and there is some overlap, as I mentioned, and we'll see these examples in more detail in a minute. But this is the fundamental difference between the two. So the results, it tends to be described as factual and descriptive. Now, bear in mind if you're doing something qualitative and you've got quotes from participants, for example, using the word factual is somewhat problematic. But if you use it loosely in terms of this is the information I've been provided with from participants or from the data, that's what I mean by factual. So it's a factual account of the results. Descriptive in terms of it purely describes what the results show. It doesn't, unlike the discussion, interpret or analyze those results. Sometimes you do get a bit of overlap with this notion of analysis in the results. Sometimes it's findings in analysis or results in analysis. I always find that a little bit misleading. I mean, there's a degree of analysis in terms of processing the results, but you don't really consider the implications or interpret your results in the results section. That's more discussion. So the results is really factual and descriptive. The discussion is more interpretive and more analytical, and we'll obviously expand on this in a minute. So the results clearly states the results of your study as they appear once processed. So you will process your data, whether it's statistical, whether it's quotes, for example. You will process that data, you'll present it in a clear, direct, and orderly fashion for your reader. That's what the results does. The discussion will remind the reader about some of what you've mentioned in the results chapter, but the discussion is much more about this. It's much more about interpretation and interrogating those results to provide a more nuanced understanding of the topic, more nuanced in terms of the shades of meaning, you know, thinking carefully about the interpretation. Well, what does this result mean, particularly in the context of this third point here, the wider research context and the relevant body of literature. So this is perhaps the single biggest difference between the results and the discussion, is that the results really just looks at your results that you've acquired in isolation. The discussion is much more about the process of relating your results to the wider research. And it's much more about engaging with what exists already and how your research agrees or differs. So it will often go back to a lot of the literature you presented in the literature review, or perhaps in the introduction, depending on where that sits. And it will feed your results into that wider research discussion in terms of what's been done before. So that's really the fundamental difference. And again, we'll see this in action in a minute. The results being very factual, being very descriptive, being very direct and to the point. It will use figures and tables or quotations, whatever it is you're using, to contextualize and expand on the data. So you would expect a lot of this to appear in the results. You wouldn't really expect any of that in the discussion. You might feel a need to include some of it for certain reasons, or you might have something you've done with sort of themes, something thematic that you might want to include in the discussion in a tabular form, but generally you don't. And as I've already mentioned, the discussion really only makes brief reference back to the results. It doesn't recite the results in any detail again. So that's sort of the main difference between the two, particularly this third bit here, how the results does not really compare your results with other studies. That's for the discussion chapter. So really, as soon as you see other research being brought in and other references being brought in, that signals it's in the discussion territory. So we're going to expand on all of this. We're going to look at examples of both. And through those examples, I'm going to be able to pick out some of the sort of the do's and don'ts, the main conventions to think about, and how to improve both parts of your dissertation, particularly the results and discussion chapters, obviously. So as we already established with the results, let's focus on this in a bit more detail now. The results is a descriptive account of the findings. And that's all it is, really. It's just saying to the reader, these are what the findings are. This is what the data shows. Put a question here about what governs the structure. There's different ways to structure a results. And really it depends on what it is you're trying to do, what's most suitable. Don't ever feel potentially misled by other dissertation examples, past or present. Dissertations can be very, very different, even in the same discipline. And it's important that you structure it in a way, yes, that's somewhat conventional and straightforward, but also in a way that suits the purpose of what you're trying to do. So one of the ways to structure a results, for example, is to break up the findings according to research questions. Now, obviously, this only works if you have more than one research question. And even if you only have 2 or 3, it doesn't tend to work so well, because that's still a lot of content to get in there. But if you have many research questions, that can be a very straightforward, easy way to guide the reader in terms of structuring the results. Hypotheses is another one. Again, this only works if you have more than one, really more than 2 or 3. But you can introduce the reader or reintroduce the reader to a hypothesis and then provide the relevant findings that relate to that. This is on the basis that you have quite well-defined subsets of data that relate very specifically and exclusively to particular questions or hypotheses. If there's a lot of overlap, these two won't work particularly well, in which case you'll more likely do one of these two, themes or subsets. Themes is much more common for qualitative. if you're trying to extract ideas from interviews, for example, or focus groups, you're more likely focus on themes. A theme can be anything really. A theme can even be a subset of data really. This is somewhat interchangeable. And when I say subset of data, I just mean a sort of a smaller part of the data. So it might be something to do with gender differences, for example, or age differences in the responses. That could be a subset of data. So these are the dominant ways. One of these, most likely, how you will structure the overall chapter. Research questions, hypotheses, potentially themes or subsets of data. More generally, what you need to think about in terms of presenting the information is what I call hierarchy of data. So you'll be expected to present the overarching and most important findings first. Any chapter really is sort of structured a bit like an upside down pyramid, or a bit like a filter. If you imagine, it's got that very broad top and it narrows its focus down, down, down. That's really the way any chapter in this sort of context is structured, which is to say that you start with the sort of the broader information first, and then the further you get into the chapter, or even the further you get into a paragraph, if you look at it at that level, the more detailed and dense the information becomes. So we think of a hierarchy of data. Start with that overarching most important findings first, and then narrow down. You'll often see results chapters start in normally one of two ways, either by providing information on sort of the responses, some of the methodological information that you haven't included in the methodology or the methods, such as saying how many participants responded, for example. Obviously, it depends what your focus is. It either starts that way, or it starts with something like 55% showed this, whereas 45% showed this. So it will start with a sort of an overarching figure first that relates to all the data, and then it will narrow down and start to focus on subsets or themes or whatever. So that's the way to think of it. Start with the broader information first and narrow down in that way. Figures, tables, quotes should supplement rather than replace your written account of the findings. So this basically means that the figures, the tables, or the quotes, whatever it is you're using, they're designed to support your written account. They're not designed to replace the written account. And it's important that even though the results is very factual, very descriptive, very direct, it's important to still treat it like a narrative, to still treat it like you're telling the reader a story, and you're still trying to talk them through the information that you're presenting. That's important to make this chapter engaging. So the figures, the tables, the quotes, they should support that written account. They shouldn't replace that written account. So for example, you wouldn't be expected to say something like see figure 1 for a breakdown of whatever. You would be expected to say that, but you'd also be expected to expand a little bit on what figure 1 shows. So talk the reader through sort of the main highlights. What do the tables, what do the quotes, whatever it is, what do they show? You've got to signpost it for the reader. You've got to walk them through it. Mirror chapter. This is a really nice way of thinking about the whole dissertation. The dissertation, its sort of standard structure, is actually structured in a very sort of careful and elaborate way, which is designed to sort of create a sort of a symmetry, and sort of create this parallel sort of structure. And it's carefully designed in order for that to be the case. And what a mirror chapter means, this is one of the ways I look at it, is that every chapter in a dissertation mirrors another chapter. So there's always two chapters that are very closely aligned. The introduction's mirror chapter is the conclusion, which obviously are opposite ends. But in terms of what both are trying to achieve, they sort of mirror each other. And I talk about that in the intro and conclusion session, which is coming up live actually in a few weeks, but there's a recorded version as well. If you want to do that, there's a link in the chat. The literature review's mirror chapter, as I'm going to discuss in a minute, is the discussion. And the results mirror chapter is the method or methodology. So the two chapters squarely in the middle of the dissertation, they mirror each other, which is to say the method or methodology is what you saying what you've done, and the results is a factual reporting on what you found. So they really mirror each other. And that's an interesting way to think of it, and particularly important when we get to the discussion in a minute. Okay, so what we're going to do, we're going to have a look at sample A. If you're watching the recorded version of this, sample A is obviously in front of you. If you're watching the live version, if you're watching this live now, then sample A is the first sample of writing in the document I provided. You might just prefer to read it on the slide. It's a very short example. Just have a very quick read of that. I'm just going to give you 1 minute to do that. And I'm just going to talk you through some of the sort of the main points as to what makes this a sort of engaging and clear results chapter. This is just obviously a paragraph, but just have a look at that. Okay, so what makes this a good results chapter, or at least what makes it clearly a result as opposed to a discussion? This firstly is a quantitative example, which should be clear from the statistics here. On that basis, something that's very, very important that a results chapter does, particularly when it's quantitative, is that it's precise and it avoids vagueness. So, for example, saying something like, most participants said this, that certainly in a quantitative results chapter isn't clear enough. You need something more specific, so some sort of statistical, something quantifiable. And so that's what they've done here. So it's because it's quantitative, very stats driven, it's very stats heavy, but it's clear, there's no vagueness in it, it's perfectly clear what the reader's saying. Notice I've put here narrative descriptive account. So it is descriptive, it doesn't really do anything with these results. All it's saying is this is what the results show. So it's factual in that respect, but it is a narrative. Sometimes it's a temptation because it's very sort of process driven, very statistical in this example, very factual, very descriptive. There's a temptation to not really narrate and walk your reader through the information, but you still need to do that. I've just highlighted one word here, conversely, which we call a transitional device. It's a very broad group of words or phrases that basically help to move the reader along from one position to the next. You know, we use them in everyday life all the time, such as however, therefore. They serve different purposes, of course. And this one, they're trying to show some sense of contradiction. They're trying to show how that this showed something, but this showed something different. And this is important. Just these little transitional devices here and there, that little bit of narration, it just helps to guide the reader along. They can't be expected to fill in those sort of what I call narrative gaps. Those sort of cognitive connections need to be made by you, the writer. There's tables and figures, or there's a table here. I've not included the table in it, but there's a reference to the table. So that table should be accompanied by a caption, which is a little descriptive bit of text above or below, which explains what the table shows. I'm going to talk a little bit about structure in a minute as well. And what I've put here is it opens with an overarching finding, which in brackets I've put topic sentence there. This first sentence here. The first sentences in the paragraphs are always important in any piece of writing, but in a results and discussion, they're very, very important. And they're very, very important because the the first sentence of a results paragraph or a discussion paragraph indicates very, very clearly, or it should do, what the focus of this paragraph is. And when you're walking the reader through lots of information, statistical or quotes or whatever it might be, you really need to get the signposting clear and right. And we're going to look at this in more detail shortly, but I just wanted to mention it there that you've got a clear topic sentence. So this is a nice clear example of a results. Like I said, it's narrative, it's descriptive, it doesn't interpret the information, it's clear to the reader what this is about. There's tables and figures, there's precision, there's no vagueness. There's more likely to be a degree of vagueness in a qualitative example because you're not dealing with statistical information, but still in terms of you presenting the information, you want it to be clear, not vague. Please drop any questions in the chat as we go. If you have any questions you want to ask, please, about the examples you look at. If there's something that surprises you or you're not sure about, let me know. Let's have another look at, let's have a look at another example. This is sample B. Again, if you're watching this live, take a look at this. If you're watching the recorded version, this is the first passage from sample B, and this is the rest of it. So you might want to just stop the video and have a read of both of those. So it starts there. Again, just take a minute to look at that. This is a qualitative example, so it's slightly different, but still it's a good example of a results. Take just 1 minute to have a look at that, and then again, I'll talk you through it. Okay, I hope you've had a chance to look at that. Don't worry if you're in the middle of reading it, you haven't finished, because I'm going to talk you through it. So there's no pressure to have read it that quickly. as I said, this is qualitative as opposed to quantitative. It's still a very good example of results for various reasons. So we talked through a couple of these points here that I've sort of highlighted. I mentioned about this topic sentence a minute ago. We've got another one here, and you'll start to see a pattern in terms of what the topic sentences do. And the topic sentences, as I said, it signposts the focus of the paragraph. That's fundamentally what it's about. That's what it's trying to do. But this often links, in a results chapter, often links to the structural organization, whether it's research question driven, whether it's hypotheses driven, whether it's thematically driven. And this is a clear example of a theme, for example. So reference to the way digital change is affecting the process of planning for advertising campaigns. That's a theme. They're highlighting that as a theme. Again, you could argue it's a subset of the data. It's sort of an overlap there. But that's what it is a theme. So it highlights that, and it's really, really clear. You get a lot of this phrasing as well in the results, a number of interviewees, or a statistic if it's quantitative. And again, that's a case of making it clear what the data shows, whether it's statistical, whether it's humans, whatever it is. It's making it clear what the data shows. So good clear topic sentence, as I said, arranged around a theme or a finding in this case. I've put here, let the quotes do some of the work. This obviously is only if you're doing qualitative. I suppose you could say more generally, let the data do some of the work. This might sound contradictory to what I said a minute ago, where I said that you've got to actually narrate the data. You can't just say, well, have a look at table 1 and work it out for yourself. You have to walk the reader through what table 1 shows, not necessarily all the nuances, but what you think is most important to extract and discuss. And that is true. You definitely need to do that. And it's the same with the qualitative one with quotes. The reason I say let the quotes do some of the work is sometimes I've seen examples where a lot of narration, a lot of sentences precede the quotes, and then when you get to the quotes, they don't really add anything because you feel like the writer's given you everything you need. So when you're dealing with quotes, try and let the quotes do some of the work. So yes, by all means, introduce the quotes like they've done here, and provide a little bit of elaboration on what the, in this case, interviewees said, but let the quotes do some of the work and let the quotes do some of the talking. As I said, if you say too much, by the time you introduce the quotes, they don't mean that much to the reader because they don't feel like they're really advancing the point further. You've also got to make good decisions about which quotes you pick as well, which of course is important. But that's something that's happening here that I think is good. They don't say too much. They allow the quotes to do a bit of the work. There's an argument they could have pulled back a little bit, maybe. Really, all you need is something that says, for instance, some interviewees talked about this, and then you provide the quote. Sometimes that's all you need. Sometimes you need a little bit more. If you're dealing with quotes as well, when quoting, I put there, delete any unnecessary digressions or fillers. I've put one here, or I've highlighted one here, where it says, what they've done is they've quoted the participants verbatim, word for word, exactly as they've sounded on the recording. You don't have to do that. You want to accurately represent what the participants in this case have said, the same way you want to accurately represent what the data shows if it's statistical data. But with quotes, you're dealing with humans, so there's going to be digressions, there's going to be mistakes, there's going to be sort of fillers like I've just done, and slip-ups in their speech. You don't need to include all of that stuff. You want to try and make your interviewees, your participants, sound clear, coherent, and intelligent. There might be some reason why keeping these is important if it shows some hesitation, or if you're really interested in something linguistically, but otherwise you shouldn't need them, and it can become distracting to read. Likewise with digressions, if it's something they talk about that's completely irrelevant that you don't need, you can take it out, it's fine. The ellipses here sort of indicates that. So if you took out, you could put ellipses in between, either in square brackets or just as I've done there. That's the convention. So if we look at the second part, this is sort of continuing from the same example. We've got another clear topic sentence, moved on to another theme. Again, it's highlighted, I've highlighted there, it's again presented in a really clear way. They've steered the reader in this direction, which is fine. Done the same process again, introduced some quotes. There's a couple of points here that the previous paragraph we just looked at didn't do because of the positioning. What this one does here is there's a couple of points here. I put there consolidates the knowledge and answers a question or responds to a hypothesis. So bearing in mind, you are responding in this dissertation, whatever it is you're doing, you're trying to respond to a question or questions, or you're trying to answer hypotheses or a hypothesis, or just generally try to achieve an aim. That has to be a sort of underlying point. That's something you're trying to achieve throughout this. So you have to really, in the results and the discussion, and to a certain extent in the conclusion more generally, actually get to the point where you will answer that question or questions or respond to what it is you're trying to achieve. And the results is really the first place that you do that. And you can see an example here. The first highlighted passage here is them sort of doing that. And then at the end, they're doing something different, which I'll explain in a minute. But if you look at what they're doing there, that's what's happening. They're consolidating the knowledge. They're bringing together what they've learned from these two themes. And they're saying, well, this proves this. Now, you don't have the whole dissertation here to see what the research questions were or what the hypotheses or whatever it was they were trying to achieve. But you can see at least what they're doing is they're bringing the information together and they're saying, okay, this is what we've learned. This is what it proves. That, at the most, is all you need to do in the results. You don't need to explore that and what does it mean for the sort of the future research and what does it mean for industry or whatever it is you're trying to do. You don't need to do that. That's for the discussion. The results stops at that point. This proves this. This answers this question. So they do that really nicely. What they then do as well, I think this actually started the next paragraph, but I brought it up to join this paragraph just to make a point, which is it ends on a counter. And what that does is it prompts the discussion, or I shouldn't use the word discussion, it prompts the move into the next paragraph of the results. So they end on a counter, prompting a new theme. I put their linearity. This is the writer moving the story forward. This is the writer moving the results forward. And they're saying to the reader, we've looked at this, this shows this, here's a new subset of results, or here's a new theme. In this case, it counters what they've just said. And by ending on that counter, it's a really nice segue into the next part of the results. I should say that we're going to talk about this in a little bit more detail in a minute. It's called a transitional statement. These are fantastic, particularly in results and discussion chapters where you're trying to show the connections between the results and the discussion points. And this is a great way to keep the story moving forward. But if you do this at the end of a paragraph, for example, it has to be picked up at the start of the next paragraph. It has to work as a prompt. If you end on that note and don't take it any further, then it's a big problem. So end of this chapter, end of this paragraph, start of the next paragraph, doesn't really matter. I'll talk to you a bit more about that in a minute. But that's what it's doing. So this is another nice example of results. This one from a qualitative compared to sample A, which is quantitative. Similarities, some differences as well, which is sort of inherent with the type of research that you're dealing with, very different types of research. But as I said, some similarities as well in terms of how it's sort of factual, it's descriptive, this is what it shows, answering a question, responding to hypotheses, moving on, looking at a new theme or subset of data or whatever it is. We're going to move on to the discussion. Just please drop any questions you have in there about the results. All right, so let's look at the discussion. I think I've said everything I sort of want to say. I think I've said everything I want to say about the results, but there's definitely some stuff that I haven't touched on because that can be very specific to certain dissertations. So if you do want to ask me anything about that, please do. So yeah, as I said, if you've got any more questions about the results, you can ask me at any point or at the end. I'll stay back at the end. You can ask me. But I think I've said everything I think I want to say, having looked at those examples. I always want to spend a bit more time in the discussion because I think it's slightly more challenging. I do think with the results, it's a case of just getting familiar with sort of a clear template, understanding what you're trying to do, making the decision about how am I structuring it as a research question, themes, and then subdividing the data according to those, and then it's pretty much sort of following the patterns we've looked at in the last two examples, particularly B, whether it's qualitative or not. As I said, discussion requires a bit more thought because it's not just a sort of a factual descriptive account. As we've already established, the discussion, it interprets the significance of the results. So it's a case of saying to the reader, well, we've looked at the results, now we need to consider what these results actually mean, which you might feel like you've sort of already done, and to a certain degree you have, but there's more depth to it. I think you also need to bear in mind that sometimes when you interrogate and interpret results in a discussion, you can sometimes reach slightly different conclusions than what your actual results indicate, which is quite possible. You can almost lead yourself to different answers to the same research question via results and discussion. So interpret the significance of the results. Again, there's different ways to structure a discussion, but it tends to be around themes. Even if it's quantitative, it tends to be around themes. And those themes, again, might just be subsets of data. But if you've got subsets of data in the results that you think there's 2 or 3, perhaps you can group together around one particular theme, then that's a good way to do it in the discussion. It's a good way to distinguish the discussion from the results. Certainly if it's qualitative, it will probably be thematically driven. It may even have the same subheadings as the results. That's not a bad thing. So, but it tends to be thematically driven, and that's because of the discursive nature of this chapter. It's a discussion-based chapter, so you'd expect there to be sort of themes that drive it. I've talked a little bit already at the beginning about how your results link to the wider field of research, and it's a case of thinking of this chapter like it's a meeting point. It's a meeting point between your results and past research and the wider field of research. It's a meeting point between the two. The results doesn't do that, but the discussion feeds what you found into that wider context. And it sort of answers some of these questions. So these are some of the key prompts I want you to think about when you write this chapter. This is what fundamentally you have to do. The main question is this: how have you advanced the knowledge on the topic? Again, you sort of do that in the results, but it's only really hammered home and brought home in the discussion because you are linking it to other research. And by doing that, what you're able to show the reader is this is what we knew before, this is what we now know, based on the results that I've provided. So again, if you think of the structure and the linearity of the dissertation, in the literature review, you're saying, well, this is what's been done before, this is what we know, here's what I want to do, here's a gap, for example. And then in the discussion, it's you returning back to that context, but now feeding what you've learned into it and answering this question. Another way of phrasing it is, what do we now know that we didn't know before? Which you have to say quite slowly because it can trip you up. What do we now know that we didn't know before is sort of what you're trying to answer. That's what this is about. That's really what the whole dissertation is about, and that's why the discussion is so important. On that theme of other research, it's also answering this question: are your results consistent or inconsistent with previous research? Now, this sometimes trips people up. Sometimes they see their results as entirely consistent with previous research and they therefore don't really know what they've learned from it. Answering these questions, what do we now know, how have you advanced the knowledge on the topic? Really, if all you say is, well, we sort of knew this before, but we've got a sort of a more refined understanding of it, we've got a deeper understanding of it, that's still very important from a reader's point of view, that you can prove that you can show that. So don't feel like you have to present something that's never been presented before, or that you've upended existing knowledge and subverted expectations. It doesn't have to be that at all. And you have to ultimately work with the results that you've got, whether they're surprising or not. But are your results consistent or inconsistent with previous research? That is a question you're trying to answer, and you will think about what might be making it consistent or inconsistent, which we'll come to in a minute. It's also worth saying there's 2 types of research used in this chapter. So based on the sort of previous question, a couple of questions we've looked at, one type of research we use is comparable studies from the literature review. So you basically go back to some of the literature that you looked at in the literature review that is most significantly related to what you've done, and you'll bring that research back in. So if there's something that you mentioned in the discussion that hasn't been mentioned in the literature review that is very closely related to your research field, then that's a bit of a problem. You probably want to go back and add that study or research into the lit review. But sometimes I get asked, does everything you use in the discussion have to be in the literature review? And the answer is most of it will, but certainly not all of it has to. And that's why you have this second type of research here, further exploratory research. So we'll see examples of this in a minute. But you'll sometimes say, well, these results are consistent with studies X, Y, and Z, which is this. Or if you say it's inconsistent with studies X, Y, and Z, that's obviously comparable studies. Further exploratory research is more the research that the additional research that you've put in to try and explore the significance of that further, particularly when your results are inconsistent. So if your results are inconsistent, really the question to answer is, well, why? What's happening to make my results inconsistent with previous results? Doesn't mean you're wrong, doesn't mean they're wrong, but what's going on? And sometimes you need additional research to help you make sense of that. Like I said, we'll see an example in a minute. I've already touched on this with the results, the mirror chapter, which is the method or methodology for the results. For the discussion, it's the literature review, for the very reason that you bring that literature back in. And that's what's happening. So that's the sort of the mirror chapter in the discussion. As I said, recapping what I said earlier, every chapter in a standard dissertation has a mirror chapter: intro and conclusion, lit review, discussion, method, methodology, and results. They mirror each other. Okay, so we're going to explore this a bit more. Let's look at examples. So sample C. These examples are slightly longer, so I'll give you a couple more minutes to read them. Have a look at sample C. If you're watching the recorded version, this is the first part of it. I'll go on the second slide in a minute so you can see the rest of it. Have a look at sample C. Think about what I've just mentioned and see if you can see what's happening in this example, what makes it a good discussion. And again, I'll talk through some of this with you. So just take a minute to do that. And I will go into the other slide as well. So that's the rest of sample C. This is one paragraph, but I've obviously split it across 2 slides to make it legible to read. So just take a minute to read that. So hopefully you'll agree that that is very, very different to the results, what we've just been looking at. Very, very different in different ways. But it's completely different in nature. And as I said, there is overlap between results and discussion, but there's quite stark differences as well in certain ways. So with sample C, one of the first giveaways, if you were to look at this and look at A and B, for example, you didn't know which was results and which was discussion, you'd probably see straight away from these citations, the number of citations, that this indicates it's a discussion. So there's engagement with wider literature. But as I said, there's 2 different types of studies going on in here. The first set here is literature that has already been mentioned before, and it's literature that they are connecting directly with their results, and they're saying that it's consistent with information they've already found. They've not phrased it in that way, but it's clear that that's what they're saying, and obviously had you read the whole dissertation, you'd know that they mentioned those studies in the lit review. So they've done that. They said it's consistent. They don't expand on that particularly, they expand on that further. And as I said here, they use additional research to supplement discussion and advance the reader's knowledge. So this is the additional research here. And what they're really doing is they're moving beyond the immediate confines of the research field, which is this here. And they're looking into what additional research says that might make sense of what they're trying to sort of say here. So they're trying to explore something in particular that came out from the findings. And they're trying to do that through additional research. And it's additional research really that's doing all the work here. So additional research that's informing the reader and the writer's understanding of that topic further. And that's what the additional research is doing. You might do this and then think to yourself, maybe I should go and add all of this stuff back into the literature review. And if you think it's an oversight, if you think you should have done that and covered that literature, then yes, go back and add it in the lit review. But if it's something that came out as a surprise almost, that's something that you weren't expecting that came out through your analysis of the data, don't feel you have to go back and add that stuff in the lit review. It's quite nice from a reader's perspective to see that you've moved beyond that immediate research and you've thought more carefully about what might be going on here and using additional research to do that. So that's a way to sort of get extra marks, really. This is that same example continued further. Again, continuing that theme with the wider literature. What they start to do sort of in this second half here is they consider the implications of the results. And this is what the discussion has to do. It has to consider, okay, well, what have we learned from this? What does it prove to us? What does it show? And consider implications for practice. This is something that will depend entirely on what your dissertation is about. If it's something that is practice-based or has a relation to practice, the discussion is most likely the place you will do this. There's an argument that could be done in the conclusion, but I'll come to that in a minute. It will most likely be done in a discussion, and they sort of do that down here. And they sort of say, well, this is what could be done. in a practice-based scenario. So they're really thinking very carefully about what they found, how it links to existing literature, which they've done here. They're then thinking, okay, well, this particular finding or this nuance of the finding, what does it mean? What's significant about it? How can I make more sense of it through additional literature, which they've done here, explored it further through here, and then they thought more carefully in the second half of this paragraph, well, what are the implications of these results? What does it mean for practice? You may not do this practice part. The implications of the results depend on what it is you're trying to achieve, but that's what they've done. Let's have a look at sample D. And again, just take a minute just to have a look at that. And if you're watching the recorded version, that sample D continued there. So maybe pause the video. So this is another discussion example, another really good one. Similar stuff going on to C, but slightly different stuff going on as well. Just take 1 minute to have a look at that. So with sample D, there's similarities here with sample C. That makes this a really good discussion chapter, but it's from a completely different dissertation, from a sort of different discipline. So there's different stuff going on here as well, which is some of the stuff that you might take for your own dissertation, depending on what you're doing. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about structure in a minute, which I've already touched on, but we've got, again, this theme that I've been mentioning a lot of a clear topic sentence, this idea that the first sentence of the paragraph signposts for the reader what the focus is. That's fundamentally all it has to do. As the shorter it is within reason, the better. The more direct it is, the better. It doesn't need to get too far ahead of itself. It just needs to say, this is, in as many words, this is what we're going to talk about in this particular paragraph. This one here does that by reminding the reader of one of the results in the previous chapter. Notice there's no real detail. It's just a reminder. You might elaborate on this in 1 or 2 more sentences and provide a little bit more detail. That's possible. But you really don't need to do too much because the reader has just read the results chapter, so they don't need you to recap it all again. You won't have the words to do it either. We've got engagement with literature again. What they've done here is they said this finding in this case contradicts. So they're saying it's not consistent. There's a difference here between what I've found as the researcher and what other researchers found. And these are the studies here that they've brought back into play that were in the literature review. So they're saying this contradicts previous research, which found this. Again, it's a reminder. This has all been done before. It's just a reminder. This is the important bit here, where they say, well, one possible reason for this statistical conflict between past research and the present study could be the highly developed online shopping context in Taiwan. So in other words, what they're now going to do is they're going to try and make sense of what that conflict and contradiction means. So this goes back to something I said earlier, trying to answer that question. Is it consistent or inconsistent? If it's inconsistent, why is it inconsistent? You really need to answer that question if it is inconsistent. It's not enough just to say it's different to what we knew before. You need to make it clear what's happening and why that difference exists. Just got a question about critical appraisal. Let me finish talking about this example and I'll come to that question because it's a good question. So that's sort of what's happening there. And to do that, they've used additional research. So the use of additional research to supplement assumption. I put assumption there, which may not be the right word because it's a bit more than an assumption, but it's certainly not. It's not factual. They don't know that for sure. It's something they're trying to work through, and to work through it, they're using additional data. This isn't data that came up in the literature review necessarily. This is additional information they found. So they're trying to make sense of this contradiction here. And they develop that discussion further. The second part of this paragraph sort of shifts more to focus on methodological considerations. And obviously you talk about your methods or your methodology in the method or methodology chapter. But when you're trying to make sense of why your results may have come out differently or even why they might be similar and what that means, sometimes it's important to think about the way you design the study and what it is that you did perhaps differently or in a similar fashion to previous studies. And that often is the underlying reason for differences in results between studies, particularly when the difference is quite stark. So what methodologically is going on that might have contributed to this difference, this conflict? And that's what they're really doing here. So they're saying another possible reason could be that participants were selected due to some experience with mobile shopping. So they're exploring that potential issue as well. So that's something else that's going on there. And then lastly, before I come back to that question, compare the topic sentence with this takeaway point. I'm going to talk about this in a minute, so I'm not going to stress too much in a minute about that. But if you see where they start, which is a reminder really about what the results in the previous chapter showed. So the study found that perceived risk has no significant influence. And you compare that with this last sentence here. What this last sentence is trying to do, more than anything, is show the reader how they, the writer, have advanced the knowledge further. So they're basically trying to say to them, well, this is where we started and this is now where we are. I'm proving to you as the reader what I have, how I've refined and developed knowledge on this topic further. And the topic sentence position and the takeaway point position, which comes at the end of a paragraph, I'll elaborate more in a minute. Those two positions of the paragraphs are really important structural components to achieve in that aim, to showing the reader the way you've moved forward, how far you've moved forward. I'm going to expand on that very briefly in a moment. Let me come back to the question about is it right that the discussion is where critical appraisal takes place? Again, the short answer is yes, but it can sort of vary. Critical appraisal, by that I'm going to assume you mean that you are assessing the strength and the validity and the cogency of the information, whether it's information that you are reviewing or whether it's your own study. So in other words, it looks at a study or studies and assesses whether the study is valid, whether it's reliable, whether it's effective, whether there are any flaws. There's different places this can happen in a dissertation depending on what you're trying to do. It will appear, or it should appear to some degree, in the literature review chapter if you have a literature review chapter, but that's obviously appraising other studies, not your own. It's appraising other studies, and it's saying, well, they failed to do this or they did this. I talk a little bit about that in the literature review webinar I've recorded, particularly in relation to identifying the gap. So you do it a bit there. You can do a little bit of methodological appraisal on your own study in the method or methodology, where you explain how you've done it. You can sort of stress some of the limitations potentially there. You can do it a bit there. There's even the case in some disciplines where you do that in the results or at the end of the results, but it's much more common to do it in the discussion. And as I said, you can sort of do it a little bit, not only with your study, but sort of bring in other studies as well. So you might say, well, the difference in these results might indicate or might be the result of the fact that I did it this way, they did it that way. I think the way I did it is better because of X, Y, and Z. So you're sort of appraising studies there as well as your own. So yeah, it can certainly appear in the discussion. It's quite common for it to appear there. Hopefully that answers the question, but come back to me if not. I'm not going to go through this example. I'm just going to show it so that if you are watching the recorded version, you can pause the video. This is another discussion example. It's in your pack of examples if you're watching this live. The reason I've included this one is it's also a good example. It does much of what we've looked at already. The difference with this one is I thought it was useful for you to see because it's an example of where the findings do not actually differ from the existing knowledge. So in other words, they say, this is what I found, this is consistent with past research. And the reason I think it's useful to see is because they don't stop there. They still think carefully about what's the significance of this similarity, what's the significance of the results. So there is a way of doing it. It's easier to make your discussion deeper and more thoughtful, I think, when your results are somewhat different, but you can still do it when the results are similar. So that's an example to have a look at. I've already been talking a little bit about structure, and the reason I want to touch on this very, very briefly is because I'm now going to sort of show you a template for how to structure the discussion. There's different ways you can do it, but the way I think is the best way. And I'm mindful of time. If you need to get away, please do. You can catch up on this on the rest of this on the recording. So yeah, I'm inevitably going to run over, which is always the case. But this won't take too long. I'm just going to cover this and then look at the template. So the way that you typically structure, this is general structure, this is the sort of the general principle of structure. The way you structure any paragraph, it tends to work as according to a principle of three, like a beginning, a middle, and end of a story. It works on the principle of three, in that you have a topic sentence, which states the focus of the paragraph. It's the first sentence, we've already established that. The discussion is most of the rest of the paragraph, and that's you moving the discussion along. It's you moving the focus of that one particular topic or focus or subtopic or whatever you want to call it. It's you moving that forward. I've used discussion there. I don't necessarily mean that in a discussion chapter context. I just mean generally discussion in the middle of a paragraph. So discussion of the data that advances the reader's knowledge further, for example. So that's what it does. It advances the focus through narrative and evidence. So it looks at evidence, it considers narrative, it joins all of this together. The bit we haven't really focused on is this sort of last two bits. We've touched on it briefly. Takeaway point and or transitional statement. So the idea is when you get to the end of a paragraph, you want to do one of two things. You either want to say to the reader, okay, we're done with this, we're going to look at another subtopic, or we're going to move on and look at something else. And therefore, what I'm going to do is this. I'm going to form a takeaway point, which means you consolidate the knowledge gained from the paragraph. So this is what we've learned from it. And you provide some sense of resolution. It doesn't mean you close it off. It's not the end of a story necessarily. But it's the bit where you say to the reader, well, this is what we've learned. This is what I want you to take away from it. That's why I call it a takeaway point. This is what I want you as the reader to take away. You could do that, or instead you could do this, which we've already looked at an example of, this transitional statement. So this is where you provide a transition to the next paragraph. So you don't necessarily close the discussion off of the paragraph. You instead ease the reader into the next paragraph. You sort of grease the wheels through to the next paragraph and keep the narrative moving forward. So what you do is you provide a transition to the next paragraph. You can do both of these. You might do this and then form this, or this might be integrated with the topic sentence. There's slightly different ways of doing it, but this is sort of the fundamental way that you structure paragraphs. Sometimes you might be familiar with some of those mnemonics that you can use, where it might say point, evidence, explain, or it might say point one, evidence one, counter evidence one, this kind of stuff. I at this level wouldn't advise you follow those too closely. I think if you find the sort of general templates useful, that's fine. But the reason I sort of use this general template like this is because it gives you enough flexibility, particularly in here, to develop the middle of the paragraph how you think is best. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to use this template, and I'm going to use it as a structural template for the discussion. And this is something that you can use or adapt, certainly, and hopefully find it useful, because I think sometimes getting the structure of the discussion right can be the tricky part. So this very much maps onto the structure we just looked at here, the topic, sentence, discussion, takeaway point, and or transitional statement. So you want to start, this is at a paragraph level, by the way. Start a paragraph by stating the theme of your discussion. So in this paragraph, this is the theme of the discussion, and that will be your topic sentence. You probably need to briefly remind the reader of the relevant findings that links to that theme. It might be findings from different subsets or just from one subset. I think if we look at this example, go back to this one, the topic sentence, well, the first sentence is both the topic sentence and the reminder of previous findings, so you can combine the two. But that's basically what you need to do. State the theme, briefly remind the reader of the relevant findings in the sentence or two afterwards, or even in the same opening sentence, as I just said. And then you start, this is where it really moves into discussion territory. Then you need to answer this question: is this consistent or inconsistent with previous literature? So by this point, we're in this discussion part, advancing the focus through narrative and evidence. Is this consistent or inconsistent with previous literature? Answer that question. And then think about why this difference exists, obviously only if there is a difference. So you can skip past this if it's consistent, but if there's inconsistent, why does this exist? As I said there, consider any methodological differences. And then this bit here, number 5, if it's consistent, you can sort of skip over 4 and go straight to 5. But 5 is basically this takeaway point here. It's sort of an extended version of this. It's not necessarily one sentence, but it's more an extended version of what do you as the reader need to take away with you. And these are some of the things to consider. So it's mainly about consolidating the new knowledge and stating the significance of this, but you can consider this in terms of practice-based implications, general advancement of knowledge. What do we now know that we didn't know before? This is the place to answer that question. Or directly respond to a hypothesis or research question. So this is what this bit does. And I think that pattern, I've worked with many students over the years through this, patterns like this, that tends to work really, really well, and it's adaptable enough for you to do what you want with it, When you get to 5, for example, you might play around with practice-based implications, for example. So I think this is a paragraph by paragraph template that you can follow. You might expand it slightly over 2 or 3 paragraphs. There is an argument that you could even follow this over the course of the whole chapter. So don't necessarily break it down paragraph by paragraph, but even state like focus on the particular themes and subsets, and remind the reader of the subsets of data at the beginning of the chapter. And then in the second part of the chapter, think about previous literature and where differences exist and if they exist. And then in the last part of the chapter, consider this stuff. The reason I would be slightly cautious of that is it tends to work better when you break this stuff down further because of the level of detail that you need, and sometimes there might be a degree of repetition. For example, there might be something in the first part, if you did it that way, where you need to draw on different consistencies or inconsistencies with different literatures, and you don't want to necessarily repeat that. So there can be pros and cons to doing it in either way, but you might break it down the whole chapter like this, or at paragraph level break it down like this. So that's just a sort of an idea or something that you can do that sort of maps onto this structure that we looked at here. Okay, just very, very briefly, I sort of put most of the information on the slide there, so I'm not going to elaborate on this in too much more detail, but the discussion can be a very flexible chapter. It can have different stuff going on in it as well. It's not necessarily just the stuff we've talked about. You can draw on some limitations. These can appear in the method or methodology as well, or instead of. They can even appear in the results. I've seen that before, but the discussion is quite a good place for them because you're thinking more carefully about the sort of the wider context of what you've done, what you might have done differently. This stuff can even appear in the conclusion. I've mentioned this at the end. Confirm this with your supervisor. So it's not even so much a case of me saying where it should go. It's more a case of me giving you the tips on it, because where it goes is somewhat flexible. What I've said here is be honest, don't be overly critical, put a positive spin on it. By put a positive spin on it, I mean it's good to highlight limitations of your study, what you didn't do so well, what you could have done better. Don't overemphasize it, obviously, because it undermines your reader's trust in what it is you've done. And one of the ways you can put a positive spin on it is this: link it to recommendations for future research. If you had another chance, what would you do, or what would you recommend other people do in your position, or future researchers do? And this is a really nice way to keep the sort of narrative moving forward. When you look at papers like this that are published, they're never closed off at the end. It's not about finding a neat resolution that ties everything up. It's about keeping a degree of openness in there, because it's an original piece of research that people are going to develop and adapt moving forward. So recommendations for future research is a way of doing that. It's a way of you saying, well, you know, more research needs to be done on this area or this area or whatever. It can also be not what you think is a limitation, but what perhaps was something that came out of your study that you were surprised by. That can be recommendations as well. So there's some prompts there to think about. Also, there's implications for practice, recommendations for professionals or practitioners. I've already talked a little bit about that. That sort of can appear in the discussion in various points, and certainly towards the sort of state the significance part of the paragraphs or the chapter, sort of down here. Okay, I'm not going to go through this, but just again, you can pause the video and have a look if you're watching the recorded version. If you've got if you're watching the live version, you've got a Word document of this already. This is what we've talked about, but it's combined. So sometimes, particularly in social sciences, for example, you might do a results and discussion combined. You bring the two chapters together, and really you do it in the same way we've done it. You just merge the two. So what you'll see from this example here is this first paragraph here with the quotes is like the results, and then it moves straight into a discussion of those results. So that's how you do it. You tend to do it thematically again, focus on one theme, provide a narrative descriptive account, provide the evidence, then move straight into a discussion of that evidence. And I'm gonna end it there.